Thank you, sir. Sir, may I start, sir?
Yeah, please. Already, I think
Sir.
5:15.
Sir. So, as sir had already said, this paper is all about statistics, and statistics. We really like at the end of the trial, the author, what he tries to do is, the message is very, very simple. We have a way of understanding the trials with a hazard ratio in place. But hazard ratio is not the only way to look into it. There are some disadvantages, even with the way we look at the hazard ratio. So there are other metrics which we need to know, and he has taken this in a totally different angle to look into another parameter by name RMST. We will see what does this RMST. So this is in substitution of hazard ratio, where like we can know objectively all the trials, as sir already said. So we have the other epidemiological studies and population based studies, strategy based studies, and molecular based studies. Can all these studies be put into one platform and see how much amount of benefit do we occur by these parameters? So that is what the author has tried to do. So for which if you want to really read this article, I feel like we should have a very, very strong understanding of statistics and terminologies. What I have done is I have done just please hold me and sit tight, because the chances of you quitting are more as the statistics involved is high. But we will just gradually go through the statistics and understand this article with the final objective. So exactly in 30 minutes, I will try to finish off. So the first thing that we need to know is, when we talk about the risk, so two things are important. One is relative risk, and the other is a hazard risk or a hazard ratio. So what does a risk generally mean? Risk refers to an absolute number of events in a population. We have no consideration of time in a risk. So say like we might be like someone might be living in the city, someone might be living in the periphery. So what is the risk of the person who is living in the city because of a population or because of the pollution present over there? So that is a very, very simple question. You try to see, like, by living in the city, does exposure to the city living cause outcome more often compared to not being exposed? So somebody is living in the village, he's not getting exposed. So does the exposure to the city person increases or not? This is a simple question where risk looks into. So we can look for drug therapies also in the form of treatment, control, event, and no event. So a subset of people are getting treated for a drug, a subset of people are staying as a control. So some events happen over here, and some events happen in the control also, and there are no events, and there are no events happening in both the treatment and control. So what does the relative risk mean? So whenever we talk about the trials, we always talk one thing, like what is the relative risk? So the relative risk is the probability of an event happening in the treatment group. So the treatment group is A plus B. They are the people who are treated. So what is the probability of an event happening in the treatment group? It is A divided by A plus B. So the probability of an event happening in the control group is C plus D. They are the control group. And the probability of an event happening in the control group is C divided by C plus D. So when we try to compare these two arms, so you have a treatment arm, you have a control arm. So when you try to compare both these groups, this becomes the relative risk. So the relative risk is the events which are happening divided by the treatment group divided by the events which are happening in the control arm plus the total number of people over there in the control group. So the relative risk is A divided by A plus B. These are the treatment group. C divided by C plus D. So this is what the relative risk is all about. So it is easy to calculate. The one mistake, because this is a very, very important mistake, which the authors have quoted in another article. They said 30 to 40% of the publications which get published often confuse between two terminologies. One is the relative risk and the other is an odds ratio. So relative risk and odds ratio should not be substituted. There is a difference which is happening between a relative risk and an odds ratio. Simply quoting, like we can say that odds ratio is probability minus 1 minus probability. So this is a formula for odds ratio, or we can odds itself is quoted as a misnomer most of the time. So odds of an event is the number of events divided by number of non-events. So the event which are happening divided by events which are not happening. So what is the odds of an event happening in the treatment group? So this is the event which is happening in the treatment group, and this is the event which is not happening in the treatment group. So it is A divided by B. So A divided by B divided by odds of an event happening in the control group. So odds of an event happening in the control group is C. So it is C divided by D. So A divided B divided by C divided by D, it becomes A by B into D by C, which is AD by BC. So this is odds ratio. If at all, if you want to forget something, forget what is odds ratio is all about. But what we have to remember about odds ratio is not a substitute for relative risk. So that is a clear message that we need to take. So then comes the second terminology which we commonly use, absolute risk. What is an absolute risk? Absolute risk is something which is very easy to remember. So instead of telling it as an absolute risk reduction, the easy way of remembering an absolute risk is absolute risk difference, we can call it as. So what is absolute risk difference? Suppose in a population, there are about 20 people, 20% of the control group develop an ailment, and 12% of them doesn't develop an ailment or the event which is happening. So what is the absolute risk difference between these two subgroups? It is 20 minus 12. So this is the event which has happened. This is the event which has not happened. So the benefit which is occurred is just 80. So subtract both the components. That gives the absolute risk or absolute risk difference. So to make it very, very simple to understand, like we need to clearly understand what is a relative risk because an absolute risk, because that forms a bigger understanding of further, like knowing what this article is all about. So in the exposed group, if you see in this exposed group, there are about 60 people and the number of people developing an event is 30. In the other group, there are again about 60 people and the number of people who are developing an event is 30. So the event that is happening, the risk that is happening in the exposed group is 3 divided by 60. The event which is happening in the unexposed group is 2 by 60. So the ratio of 3 divided by 2 is going to be the relative risk. Very, very simple. So which gives about 1.67. Very fine. So what is the absolute risk difference between these two groups? So here the ratio is 5%, or we can put it as 0.05, 5 divided by 100, or the risk which is happening is 0.03. I said subtract these two things, that becomes the absolute risk difference. So 0.05 minus 0.03 is equivalent to 0.02. So or 2% is the absolute risk difference which is happening between these two groups. So this is absolute risk difference. Now comes the second terminology. So we have understood what is relative risk, what is absolute risk. So having understood both these things, now comes the second other terminology which we need to know, which is hazards. When we meant by relative risk, so relative risk, the simple question that we need to ask is, does exposure cause outcome more often than not being exposed? So when we saw the simple example, so when a city guy is not getting exposed to pollution, how much is he getting? So that is called as relative risk, just whether he is getting exposed to pollution or not getting exposed to pollution. But when it comes to hazard, it is always with respect to time or with respect to speed. So hazards refers to the speed of the specific event in a population. So a hazard is therefore a time to event estimate and will never reflect the absolute risk of an event in the population. So the statistical question that asked in a hazard rate is, does a specific exposure cause outcome quicker than to not being exposed. So the question is very, very simple. So what is it? Do we ask with respect to time? So does a specific exposure, so exposure to, say, we will, all this article mostly dwells on SGLT2 inhibitors and the way we interpret. So does exposure to SGLT2 inhibitor cause a CV even than to being not exposed? So it is always with respect to quicker than not being exposed. So this is a hazard. So relative risk doesn't take into time. Hazard ratio take with respect to time. So what is an hazard ratio? So the hazard ratio, this rate describes the risk of developing an event immediately after that given time. So you have a treatment group, you have a control group. So in the treatment group also, you see the hazard with respect to time. And in the control group also, you see the event with respect to time. So in both the things, we calculate with respect to time. So the ratio which has been developed with respect to time, both in the treatment group and the control group, becomes the hazard ratio. So to evaluate treatment effects, the ratio of hazard rates in the treatment group and the placebo group is typically reported. Hazard ratio is usually obtained from a proportional hazard model. We will not get into all these things. So this was derived by Sir David Cox almost about 50 years ago. So these are all mathematical models. We don't need to get into all these things, but this was developed in the Cox proportional analysis, how we are going to interpret the data. So that we will come slightly later, but these are all being developed even 50 years back. So the proportional hazard model is convenient. The hazard ratio summarizes the treatment effect into a single number. So when we say hazard ratio, it is 0.83, 0.85. It is implemented in standard statistical software, and it allows for a straightforward hypothesis testing. So we just tested the hypothesis based on this. Let us say a clinical trial which investigated the survival rates for two drugs, say A and B. They reported hazard ratios and relative risk ratios were both 3. So in both the things, so relative risk is 3 and hazard ratio is also 3 for both the things. What does it mean? So the relative risk ratio tells you that the risk of death is 3 times higher with the drug A than with the drug B over the entire period of the study. So, but hazard ratio says at any point of time when you are exposed to the drug, you are having a risk of 3 times higher. So at any point of time, that is the most important thing. But relative risk says 3 years down the lane is 3 times higher. Even on exposure, even on that particular day, when an individual is getting exposed, drug A poses 3 times higher risk than drug B. So this is what hazard ratio gives. So it is very important for us to understand what relative risk and what hazard ratio is all about. So when we typically see the most of the data, most of the cardiovascular outcome trials, whenever it gets published, we always see the hazard ratio 0.83, 0.86, 0.85. Now having understood all these things, now let us presume how will we expert this hazard ratio even in a meeting. So when we present this slide, so how do we convince our audience, or how do we convince our patients that the hazard ratio is 0.86? So it needs so much of understanding for us to know what this hazard ratio is all about. So that is the most impractical way of looking at the hazard ratio. So for making it very clear, so what happens is in the placebo arm, the events are happening at 1. So whereas when we give empagliflozin, the events are happening at the rate of 0.86, means that the events are getting decreased. So this is what hazard ratio tells us. So this decrease in the event doesn't happen at the end of the trial. So the decrease in the events happening over here, over here, over here, and over here. So though the event rate differs significantly, the hazard ratio comes even with at this point, at this point, at this point, and at this point. So everywhere. So 6 months, 1 year, 2, 1.5, 2 years, 4 years, everywhere it is there. So then comes this confidence interval. So now even now after explaining this, how do you explain your patients, or how do you explain in a forum what hazard ratio is all about? So do we need to tell all these statistics for people to understand what this hazard ratio is all about and how we put into practicality? So that is not practically possible. So you have to spend at least 5-10 minutes to make them explain what a hazard ratio is all about, and then tell the data. So it makes it very cumbersome and very impractical. That is why the authors have put in a terminology by name as RMST. So in a survival time graph. So this is a survival time graph, Cox progressive analysis. So in a survival time graph, RMST is a more useful parameter than what the hazard ratio gives. So then comes this confidence interval. So here we saw what does this confidence interval about 0.74 and 0.99. So for a 95% of the events, and the p-value is superior. So whenever we interpret, be it a relative risk, be it an risk, be it a hazard ratio, whatever be the thing, always you should talk in terms of confidence interval, be it RMST that we are going to see also. So everything should have a confidence interval and whether the p-value is significant or not. So what does the confidence interval mean? So the typical example is like I give an exam and I score in one subject 94 and in another subject 40 marks. So someone else you give an exam, so where you have been consistently able to give in both the papers 80 and 82. So in the next exam, when we are being given, so what is the probability that you can score or you can reflect what you had scored in the previous exam is? So that is what confidence interval is all about. So confidence interval, whenever it is less than 1, it means that the data will get reflected exactly. So when it crosses that one level, the data are on one way it is positive or over the board, and one way it is negative, that these data cannot be reflected. Let us presume with this simple example rather than that complex model of school exams. Suppose let us presume like a confidence interval of 0.67 and 1.32 means the problem may be as low as 67 or it may be increased by 32%. So when you want to give a drug, we always feel that this confidence interval should come less than 1. So why do we always tell that it is statistically significant and clinically significant only when the upper limit of confidence interval is less than 1? So why do we say so? Because we don't want the events to get increased by 32%. So if the confidence interval upper limit is 1.02, what does it mean? So the problem or the risk with the drug may be increased by 2%. So there is a probability that the drug can increase the event also. So it means two things. One is the drug, whenever it goes away from the unit line, it doesn't become significant, or we can interpret it in a different way. Say like if the confidence interval is 10, what does it mean? So it means that the number of subjects who are recruited for the study is very less. So whenever you find a confidence limit 0.67 to 4, it means that the study is not being properly done and it has to be replicated with more number of subjects so that we are able to get a narrow down data. So the data is in the exam results. So you get narrowed down in both the exams. If you fare 80 on 82, it means it gets narrowed down. So if someone scores 40 in one exams and 90 in other exams, it becomes widely separated, and this and it will not be able to get reflected in the next exam also because of the wide variance in the confidence interval. So when we mean by confidence interval, as I said, two things are important. One is whether it crosses the unit line or not. When it crosses the unit line, it doesn't become significant. At the same time, the trial has to be repeated with more number of subjects so that the confidence interval comes down. So why do we look into always like 95% of the interval, the confidence interval should be less than 1? Because we take 2 standard deviations are always like, you can relate to growth charts or any other things. So 2 standard deviations are acceptable limits. But when you see three standard deviations, only 68% of the data you will get. So that is the reason where we get only 2.5% on right and 2.5% you take from the left side, so that the data over the mean gets deflected, and 95% of the time it is getting reflected with the same amount of things. So if you see here, 95% of the times, so for 95% data, whether the confidence interval comes less than 1 or not. So this is what confidence interval matters. So when you see a confidence interval more than 1, it means that this data is statistically not significant and clinically significant, whereas in this data it is statistically significant and clinically significant. This chart we have discussed a number of times. Just to reiterate, it should not go above 1, so it becomes statistically insignificant. Also, since it goes above 0.85, it is clinically significant. If both the data come less than 1 and upper limit comes less than 0.85, it becomes statistically significant and clinically significant. I think we have discussed this chart 2-3 times. So when it comes to hazard ratio, what happens is when we try to do it in a trial, like be it an SGLT2 inhibitor or any other thing, there are 2-3 problems which come in the typical randomized control trials. So what happens is, at 1 year follow-up, see the high risk people. So these are the people, these red people are the high risk people, these green people are the low risk people. When the endpoint is reached, the high risk people gets dropped out. The high risk people, the more high risk people get dropped out at the end of 2 years of trial. So what happens? What do you remain at 2 years of interval is the people who are not at high risk, who should be exposed to the drug at this point of time. So since they are getting dropped because of the event which is happening, so the hazard ratio is going for something called as built-in selection bias. So hope I'm able to convince this point. So what happens in a randomized control trial is, so you give a drug whereby the people, the high risk people as shown in the red, gets dropped out. So if you see in the treatment group also, they get dropped out because the event has occurred in them. That is the reason why they are getting dropped out. But they should be able to say, if it is a 4-year study, the high risk people are getting dropped out. So who are the people who are getting exposed to the drug? It is the low risk people who are getting exposed to the drug. So the hazard ratio is having a built-in selection bias in the population level, which is a deterrent of this study. And the second important point is, whenever we talk about hazard ratio, so we saw in SGLT2 inhibitors, the chart that we had seen, the hazard ratio is 0.86. Let us presume the hazard ratio is 0.8 itself. So there is something called as observed hazard ratio and a causal hazard ratio. The observed hazard ratio is the one which we always mention. So if you see even in this SGLT2 inhibitor data, so the hazard ratio is 0.86. I said it is applicable to here, applicable to here, applicable to here, and applicable to here. But that should not be the case really. So we should know what is the hazard ratio which is happening at 6 months, what is happening at 12 months, what is happening at 18 months, what is happening at 24 months. So that sort of data is not available anywhere. It is giving as a fixed risk. Over here also the hazard ratio is 0.86, and over here also it is 0.86. So that is what this data gives. So it gives an observed hazard ratio of 0.8. So it is a fixed data, but the data doesn't get produced over here like this. So as the time goes, the hazard ratio actually gets widened or decreased. So this is called as causal HR. So this sort of causal HR is the most relevant to individual patient and describes the expected relative treatment benefit for individuals immediately after that time. So we need to know what is the risk at this point, what is the risk, what is the hazard ratio at this point. So this sort of data is not getting produced or not getting reflected in the randomized control trial. So this is the second disadvantage with respect to hazard ratio. Now comes the most important point, like the authors which they explain. So I will take just 2-3 minutes in explaining this chart, which is very, very important for us to understand the way how we interpret the relative risk and absolute risk difference and all. So as you see over here, so these are the placebo arms. So this is the base risk. So the base risk can be as high as 100. So the risk in the population can be as high as 100, or the risk can be as high as 20. So we need to know, like, what is the base risk rate in that population. It could be like, see, like it could be CVOT. So when we talk about atherosclerotic vascular event, the base risk may be something 20. But in a real time, the base risk for that patient might be just 3. So the CV event, which is happening with the base risk of 20 in the atherosclerotic event, is not going to be 3. So because the events are going to be very less in a non-atherosclerotic vascular events. So in that case, the base risk rate is going to be 3. So in case if the population has got a very high risk, suppose let us presume 80 years old, who have twice the revascularization procedure done. So if you try to introduce SGLT2 inhibitors for that patient, so the base risk might be as high as 100 in those patients. So this is how the population base risk rate for 1,000 patient years. So for 1,000 patient years, what is happening? In the SGLT2 inhibitors, especially with respect to EMPOWER study, so the base risk rate was 20. So just understand what this base risk ratio is about. Or this is the placebo, what happens in the placebo. The rate with which the events happen in the placebo is the base risk rate. So having said that, if you see this in this X and Y axis, the relative risk and the absolute risk. So if you see the base risk and the absolute risk, it moves around a fulcrum which is 0. So what does it convey? So the absolute risk reduction improves if the base risk ratio is more. So it moves around a fulcrum of 0, where absolute risk difference, the more negative it is, the better it is. So because the risk difference should go down, the risk difference should not go up. So if you see here, this is number needed to harm. So as we go on the positive line, the risk goes up. As we go on the negative line from 0, minus 10, minus 20, minus 30, minus 40, the risk comes down. Minus 80 is normal. Now let us presume a subject who has gotten relative risk difference of 0.4. So when he has a relative risk difference of 0.4 and the absolute risk difference of about minus 60, just give me a minute, please. Okay. So the third point that we need to know is the slopes become steeper as the base rate decreases. So if you can see here, so the slope rate becomes from here to this is more in the 90 degrees angle. So it becomes steeper as the base difference rate decreases. So for a relative risk of 0.4 and relative risk of 0.4 reduction by treatment translate into a negative absolute risk difference of 60 to 100. So it translates to an absolute risk difference of 60 for 1,000 patient years at a base rate of about 100. So you can see here for 0.4, the absolute risk difference is 60 for if the base rate is 100. At the same time, but only to an absolute reduction of 12. So as you see over here, now just concentrate on this 20 line, this line. So when this absolute risk difference comes to 12, as I saw over here, when it comes to 12, the rate that is going to happen is about 20. So what the authors convey is absolute risk difference is strongly dependent on the base risk rate. So this absolute risk difference is strongly dependent on the base risk rate. So you can see that for the same amount of relative risk, based on the base risk rate, the absolute risk difference differs between minus 60 to minus 12. So what determines? So the relative risk is going to be the same in both these people, but the absolute risk difference is dependent on what sort of exposure or what is the base rate that is happening in these people. So this we can again we can give it as the number needed to treat and the number needed to harm. So the number needed to treat and number needed to harm are, here it is about 17, here it is about 83. We all know like 1 by absolute risk difference is going to be number needed to treat. So whether we translate it into a number needed to treat or we see it as an absolute risk difference, so the problem is what we need to understand with this Cox ratio is, whatever that happens, it all depends on what is happening in the placebo, and it makes us difficult to understand all this concept, because you till I presented this article, I didn't know what was the base risk which was happening in this population. So it is about 20. So this sort of data is not available with a hazard ratio population. So someone who is interested in knowing about absolute risk versus relative risk can get to this article. Hope I made the points very clear in this chart, because it is very important for us to understand, so that we know the disadvantages of looking at the hazard ratio. So this is the third disadvantage which happens when we look into absolute risk difference or a relative risk or an event driven, because it always depends on the base risk rate. So the number needed to treat is 17 for 1 year. Let us presume for in a hypothetical case. So in a case, it is in a hypothetical situation, the number needed to treat is 17 for 1 year, and number needed to harm is 8 for 1 year. For every 100 people treated with this theoretical intervention, 17 people who would have otherwise had CV death will be alive, whereas 8 people would have otherwise have been alive would have died. So where we do some harm also. So we always should see how much of benefit which happens. So whatever be said and done, 17 people have been saved, 8 people have died. So it has benefited about 9 people. So the point is that one must scrutinize the overall benefits and harms of an intervention and just not focus on the CV benefits while ignoring the non-CV harms. So let us take this example, where like in leader trial, so the risk of pancreatic carcinoma is always there. So we should not just look into the positive data which was happening with the leader trial. Also, we should look into the non-CV harms which are happening in this trial also. So the other point that the author conveys is, there is a within trial and between trial comparison. So what we try to do is, we always, so we know like be it a declare, be it a canvas, or be it a MPAREG. So we have like all people who are slightly similar. The events which were driven also is similar, but also we should know that there is a whole gamut of difference which is happening among these people. So reading the methods of sections of published RCT, the information which are given in the online supplement, especially in the abstracts, one can find a labyrinthine list of criteria for participant inclusion, exclusion, event adjudication, definition of primary, non-primary, composite endpoints, adverse events. So there are so much of data available. So when we try to shift any of these thresholds, predictably recalcifies patients as well as outcomes and may impact the results of a trial. So thereby the statistics also. So we should not try to look into club all these data and put into meta-analysis and see all this data. So we should not get tempted to venture into trial comparisons, in particular in trying to argue a class effect. So where the author says that, so with a lesser consistency and greater heterogeneity of trial results, because we know that the outcome of each trial is going to be different. The evidence derived from a meta-analysis is less than compelling. So the clinician should pose yet another questions. They wonder whether the same endpoint differ across trials, and when treatment includes multiple effects, whether their side effect is comparable within each trial. So if you see over here, so whatever like this is the confidence interval, the events which are happening. So when we see within the trial, so this is the red is canvas, and the green is declare. So even if you see within the trial, as the base risk rate increases, the absolute risk difference comes down. So it is very true. So or when we try to compare outside the trial also, as you see the events over here. So the base risk rate, when it is less compared to base risk rate, when it is higher, the events come down also. So when it is compared within the trial or outside the trial, the absolute risk difference is trying to come down. So both within the trial and when we try to compare outside the trial also, it is all within the confidence interval. So the risk comes down. But when it is with respect to the relative risk, the data are not falling in line. It is all haphazard. So this is another, even when we try to see an absolute risk difference, we are not able to get transformed as a relative risk between these trials, and it is all getting, the data are getting into a cloud, and we are not able to interpret these data. So what does an hazard ratio of 0.68 for CV death implies that empagliflozin can save 32% of deaths? So does it mean that a hazard ratio of 0.668 for CV death implies that empagliflozin can save 32% of the death? So that is not the case. So what the result means is that the treatment was associated with the 32% lower population chance of observing a CV death related to the placebo within the time trial period of 4 years in a high risk cohort with an atherosclerotic rate with the base event rate of 20 per 1000. So if the base risk ratio is about 1000 per patient, if the patients are non-atherosclerotic, the risk which is happening is going to be much less. So this is what the data shows. So we have to know what this 32% or an hazard ratio of 32% means. So much of confusion. As I said, like we are not able to explain what an hazard ratio, the absolute risk difference and relative risk difference are getting different. It is always dependent on the base risk effect. So we are not able to tell in a meaningful way what is really happening to the patient. So for that, the authors have simplified a terminology by name or a mathematical model, which is called as an RMST. RMST is restricted mean survival time, which tells the time of missed events in the treatment versus placebo arm for the duration of the trial. So as you see over here in the blue, so how much amount of time which is getting missed by being in the placebo arm, and by being in the trial arm. So it gives us a number of days that the individual is going to spend over here. So for us to make us very simple, so what we have understood is the events which happen per 1000 patient years. So the events are happening control, active. So control, active, it is getting separated, it is getting not separated. So whatever be the thing, the hazard ratios are always expressed as a linear number. So it doesn't say like whether it happens with time or without time. So over the entire time duration, the hazard ratio is going to be the same. So this shows the survival. So you have a drug, you have a placebo, so it shows the survival. But what does RMST gives is, RMST tries to give as a single number. So whether it is at 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year or 5 year. So how much amount of benefit it has given. So instead of looking data with an hazard ratio perspective, looking the data with the RMST is going to tell in a meaningful way how much amount of life, instead of not as an absolute risk reduction, as a number of days, how much it is going to help. So if you see a hypothetical data, hazard ratio of 0.83, it is a single number that is reported to summarize the treatment effect, assuming that the number is identical at all follow-up time. The magnitude of this number, however, lacks a clear causal interpretation. So it doesn't have a clear causal interpretation. But what does RMST gives? It gives a survival of about 39 days and absolute effect measures, which is easier to interpret. So what does it say? Here, treatment gives on average 39 days longer survival in the initial 2 years. Very simple. So let us put this data to sprint data. The hazard ratio is 0.75. The clinical relevance of this treatment is hard to evaluate from the hazard ratio alone. So we are not able to say what it is. So we see that it is clinically significant, but how does it get transformed? So we are not able to know the absolute risk difference and the base rate of the population, and able to tell how much patient they would have got benefited. So in one RMST gives on 1 year follow-up, the value is RMST value is 0.08. So if you see the confidence interval is moving from minus 1.3 to 1.1. A data which moves from minus to positive is not at all significant, which we saw. So that makes it simple. During the year of follow-up, there is no significant difference in the outcome between intensive therapy and standard therapy. So it doesn't matter at all. So it doesn't become significant. No significant data also over here. But on 4 years follow-up, 13 days have been gained. So during the initial 4 year of follow-up, intensive treatment significantly delays the time to outcome. The intensive treatment group is free of major adverse coronary events, 13.2 days longer. So on 4 years of follow-up, by doing the sprint protocol, the number of days on 4 years follow-up the patient is going to get is 13 days. So this is what the benefit that the patient gets. So this is a formal calculation. When we try to interpret to our EMPA-REG trial, so it yields a value of about 0.7 months per person. That is the benefit that our patient gets, which gets meaningfully transformed to 21 days with a 95% confidence interval on average. A less impressive message. So it is not as robust as we think for the primary even, that it is not giving a big advantage, though it gives a big advantage, but the outcome is not as robust as we think. So the RMST metric, unlike the hazard ratio, is independent of assumptions. We don't assume anything. Even if the data is non-inferiority, even it is a low risk population, still we can interpret RMST, and it always also helps in the benefit risk assessment, like similar to our AR and number needed to treat. So if you see over here, for RMST was calculated, this is the reference which the authors have given. So RMST with respect to, I'll show SGLT2 inhibitors is, SGLT2 inhibitors, EMPA-REG. So it is about 17 days. Declare it is 41 days. Canvas it is 31 days. And we can see for all the drugs. So TZDs, GLP-1 analogs, and DPP-4 inhibitors. So not much benefit. So Savartimi gives 0.2, whereas TCOS gives minus 0.1. So this I leave it to Sir and viewers to interpret how to take this data. So it doesn't give benefit as we think. But the longer studies which have been studied, say ACCORD or ADVANCE or Steno and all, if you see, it gets meaningfully translated to 227, follow-up study 693, UKPDS. So when we treat aggressively, more patients are getting benefited. So that is the power of this study. So the longer the study, it gets meaningfully transformed to longer data. But with this shorter studies, we are not able to show that how much these 17 days are significant. So this is what the RMST data gives. With this, I conclude and leave it to the discussion. Hope I made it clear and simple. Thank you.
Gauri, unbelievably good. Really, I tell you, because we can discuss some of the scientific aspects of diabetology or even related subjects, hypertension, dyslipidemia, even without the slides. I think this is such a difficult topic. I think you've done it beautifully, excellent. In fact, in between, when you are having an issue discussing about the extrapolating from the risk in the population, it was 1,000 years, I didn't want to interfere at all, because you were doing it so nicely and required that amount of extra time for you to just get adjusted that temporary. Yeah, in fact, I didn't want to interfere at all because it was so good, and you did it so brilliantly. You did it so brilliantly. Now, I think this is an eye-opener for all of us, because we are doing a lot of meetings. And when we do meetings, I think, since clinically, I think we are, I wouldn't say we are extremely knowledgeable, we are fairly knowledgeable. I hope RSS will agree. Whereas when it comes to statistical interpretation, I think this is an aspect which we are learning. which we are learning, and we always look upon the people who are good in the statistical interpretation. And a fundamental thing is, whenever you talk about an exploratory analysis, post hoc analysis, in fact, there are many of our own colleagues, it's a post hoc analysis, they will not even bother. I always used to wonder, see, clinically, why should we be so hardened about statistical parameter? When clinically there's a signal, whether it is captured as a primary or a secondary endpoint or as a post hoc analysis, now we know how an apparent benefit and the magnitude is not necessarily benefit, the magnitude of the benefit, how it can be interpreted. I think what I have understood, I've also read this paper 2 or 3 times, but the way I don't think I would have presented with the clarity that you have done it. Really, honestly, I admit you have done a brilliant job, Gauri. Not to just flatter you. Yeah, excellent job. Now, whenever we talk about the relative risk, yeah, the relative risk can be 56%, 44%, etc. benefit hazard ratio. But this relative risk has to be translated in the population. When you translate it into the population, as you rightly said, when you go across the trial in the Kaplan-Meier curve, the number at risk, you'll always see it starts with 4,000 in a trial at the first year. At the end of 4 years, it will be 937. You may think, what's happening? Is there a dropout? No, the number at risk comes down. As the events are there and there is a drop in both the arms, certainly the number comes down. So that is one way, one aspect which you nicely explained. Second thing is what it means for a particular intervention, be it a strategy or a molecule, it is the absolute risk. When it is, as you said in the simple example, 12% and 8%, 20% and 12%, 8%, it's very, very simple. But when it is going to happen in a huge population over a period of time, the absolute risk can be 2.2, 3.3. So the reciprocal of that is the number needed to treat, which is dictated by the background risk of the population. You nicely, beautifully highlighted for the same relative risk of 0.4, 60% benefit, 0.4. If it is 100 events in 100 per 1,000 patient years, then the risk is somewhere around, I forgot the number. Whereas when the risk is only 12, when the risk is, it is about 1.8 or 2. So for the same relative risk, the absolute risk, which is relevant to the clinicians to have an idea about the number needed to treat with all the limitations. You always say the number needed to treat is based upon the absolute risk. The absolute risk is dictated by the basic risk in the population, not extrapolated directly from the relative risk. I think this is the point you beautifully highlighted. And this basic risk in the population, because it is a randomized study, it comes down. It is not uniform. At the start of the trial, the basic risk is so much. It is what is happening in the placebo group. But for an individual patient, I think the risk varies. This is an excellent point that you nicely highlighted. That is number one. Then number two is that the restricted mean survival time. I think this is a new concept. I never knew about this. See, one of the aspects of the EMPA-REG outcome, I think all of us talked about EMPA-REG. BA has requested and they were so nice. And I have talked. I have always been impressed with the one of the 3 primary means, that is the cardiovascular mortality, because only in EMPA-REG it is witnessed, not in any other trial. That's a 38% risk. The hazard ratio is 38%, or 62%, 38% risk reduction. This risk reduction, when it's 38%, it looks huge. When you translate it into the number needed to treat, it's about 40%. But in a given patient, what does it mean by the RMST? It just postpones death by 23 days, 3 weeks. I think it's absolutely amazing. So for the first time, a statistical entity has been introduced by Eli Ferranini in this article we are exposed to. I have never heard about this entity called RMST, that is the restricted mean survival time, which is a mathematical model. Again, it operates by the same confidence interval. If you do it, then for an individual patient, how much for the endpoint, say for example, CV mortality, what is the benefit the patient is getting? It's just 21 days. And look at the sprint trial. The upper limit of confidence interval were within what you call the statistically significant. Both of them were within less than unity. And the upper limit of 95% confidence interval was about 0.83 or 88. So it is within the statistical power. But when you look at the RMST, it is just few days of benefit for the event, whatever is identified as a primary event. Probably, I think we as clinicians need to learn a lot of statistics, need to learn how to interpret it. More than how to interpret it, we should not get carried away probably by some of the industrial messages which we try to, because not necessarily because we have been influenced by the industry, we believe in that. When such an aspect is thrown, because of our limited knowledge in statistics, we tend to get carried away by a post analysis, and the empirical outcome has been repeatedly highlighted. And sprint trial, I was really surprised with the statistical significance of 17% or what, 21% or whatever it is, just to realize that it is by 14 days that at the end of 4 years, in fact, at the end of 1 year, it doesn't make sense at all, because it's from 1.4 minus 1.4 to 11 or something, doesn't make difference or any sense at all. Whereas at the end of 4 years, it is going to postpone by 2 weeks or 14 days. I think for an individual patient, whatever these landmark trials or the interpretation of landmark trials, which we are seeing in the journals and which we are reading, I think, and we have a message which we are sharing with our colleagues, and we also believe in that. Probably it has to be taken with a pinch of salt. I think regularly we can do some statistical exercise to gain more and more insights into meaningful interpretation of the data, which is helpful for us to position a particular strategy or a molecule, and also to give a relevant message to our clinicians. Because even without ill intention also, we should not convey a wrong message when it comes to an academic platform. So I think this was the feedback that I thought. I'm sure many my friends there, Professor RSH is there, Paneer is there, and Rajesh, anybody would like to offer something? Of course, you have taken a lot of time, quite justifiably. I just wanted it because this is a paper and interpretation. I don't think we can just individually read and understand. Maybe other papers we can do it, whereas this, that's why purposely I didn't interrupt you. So people might be thinking, because it's Sunday evening already about 6:05. But is there a compromise on Rajesh's time for the next paper? No, there won't be. But this is a paper beautifully highlighted. Any other points that strikes you?
Excellent, sir. Excellent.
I think from this, what shall we, monthly spotlight forum, I would like to confer the title of the best presenter in the to Gauri. I'm sure all of you.
I have only one doubt, sir.
Really? No, the way you have understood and then it's very, very difficult. As I told you, we can keep talking about the science even without any slides. We can rattle day in and day out. We have been doing it. I don't think it's a big task the way you have done it. Thank you so much. Wonderful. And my friends, I think you will apologize to Gauri and me for allowing him to take that almost 1 hour, 50 minutes presentation, which is absolutely justifiable. Brilliant paper, learned a lot. Again, relative risk, absolute risk, background risk in the population. How you can interpret number needed to treat. Yes, we have been following. Even that could probably be misleading. What is probably more relevant is the RMST. Let us learn more in the future meetings. With this intro, I think with this I conclude this paper presentation. We'll go on to this next paper, regulation of skeletal homeostasis.
Thank you, sir.
Now, when it